On a biting night of cold, a millionaire slows down his own world upon noticing someone that everyone has learned to ignore. The unlikely encounter between wealth and abandonment reveals deep scars, where pride, pain, and dignity still struggle to survive. Between silent gestures and unspoken truths, two pasts recognize each other as if they were broken reflections of the same story. But when hidden interests and threats arise, this unexpected bond will be put to the test in a way that no one could predict. Before diving into this moving story, already leave your like and subscribe for more reports that show how a simple gesture can change destinies forever. The fine rain falling over Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima on that Thursday in July seemed less like a meteorological phenomenon and more like a sentence. Renato Cavalcante left the Amado restaurant with his jacket buttoned, the bearings of his watch reflecting the yellow light of the lampposts, and stopped for a moment under the marquee to check his cell phone. It was 11:42. Dinner had been long but productive, 3 hours negotiating the terms of a partnership with Portuguese investors who finally seemed convinced that Brazil, and more specifically his construction company, was a safe harbor for their capital. Renato was 43 years old and carried in his body the composure of someone who learned to be impeccable because he had no other choice. The son of a woman who washed others' clothes for 20 years in Brás, he built everything alone. And the word everything was not a metaphor. Rechavo Incorporações earned that year a little over 300 million reais. The office in the penthouse of the building he himself had erected on Faria Lima was the kind of detail he never mentioned in interviews, but that never went unnoticed. The driver was 2 blocks away. Renato walked down the wet sidewalk with the serenity of someone who masters his own step until he saw him, or rather, saw her. On the other side of the street, leaning against the iron railing of an already closed bank branch, there was a woman. Not an indistinct silhouette, but a presence that caught his gaze with a force he could not explain at that moment. She wore a jacket too thin for the July cold of São Paulo, faded pants and a pair of sneakers that had fulfilled their useful life a long time ago. Her dark hair was damp, stuck to her face. She was not begging. She did not hold out her hand. She did not look at anyone. She was just there, huddled over herself, as if trying to occupy the minimum possible space in the world. 2 people passed by her in the 30 seconds Renato stood still. The first didn't even look. The second slightly diverted their path as if her presence represented some indefinable risk. Renato knew that movement. He had done the same years ago before understanding what it cost to be ignored. He crossed the street. There was no plan. There was no calculated philanthropy, no image strategy or impulse of guilt. There was only the silent recognition of something he would only be able to name later, when he was alone. When he got close enough, she raised her eyes, brown, deep, with that specific expression of someone who has already prepared for disappointment, even before knowing what is coming. "Is everything okay?" The question came out without ceremony, direct, but without the harshness of someone who asks just to fulfill protocol. She did not answer immediately. She evaluated him with the caution of someone who learned that a stranger's kindness usually has a price. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice came out hoarser than she probably intended. Renato stayed where he was. He did not move closer. He did not step back. "How long have you been out here?" She blinked. The question was different from the ones she expected. "Since about 7. It was almost midnight. He did the math without commenting. He took off his jacket, the same jacket that had cost 2,300 reais in a tailor shop in Jardins, and extended it toward her with a gesture that was not of condescension, but of something more like a reciprocal obligation between human beings. "You don't need to," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I need you to stay warm while we talk." She looked at the jacket. She looked at him, and with the slowness of someone who distrusts every inch of the gesture, she placed the piece over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, warm, and smelled of something she did not immediately identify. Wood, leather, the discreet residue of an expensive perfume. "There's a snack bar on the next street," Renato said. "Coffee, something hot, just that." She was silent for a few seconds that seemed longer than they were. The cold was biting. The fine rain continued, impassive. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, as if it deserved an honest answer. "Because I already saw my mother in this situation, and at that time, nobody stopped." Something in the answer, the absence of dramaturgy, the almost clinical dryness with which he said it, was what convinced her. Not the pity, not the expensive jacket, not the car she saw parked 2 blocks away. The unadorned honesty. She stood up slowly, as if her body needed internal authorization for every movement. "Mariana," she said, and it was an introduction that sounded almost like a test, as if she were checking if her own name still existed in her mouth. "Renato," he replied, and added nothing more. They walked side by side through the wet Faria Lima, 2 strangers united by something that didn't have a name yet, while the city continued its habitual indifference around them, oblivious to the fact that that sidewalk was about to change both their lives in ways neither of them had predicted. The snack bar was called Ponto 24 and was located on a side street, a place with formica tables and fluorescent light and the perpetual smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was exactly the type of place Renato Cavalcante hadn't frequented for years, and exactly the type of place where he felt that night more at home than in the restaurant he had left. They sat down. The waiter brought the menu without ceremony. Renato ordered 2 coffees and a platter of cheese bread without consulting her, and she let him because there was something in the gesture that was less arrogance and more the habit of someone who takes care. Mariana was 38 years old, although she seemed older at first impression, not because of her features, but because of the weight she carried in her gestures. She looked at the table for a long moment before saying anything. "You don't need to do this," she said. But this time the phrase had a different texture. It wasn't a refusal, it was a warning. "Do what?" "Treat me like a project." Renato gave a slow, almost involuntary smile. "I don't have patience for projects that don't interest me." "You interest me." She raised her eyes. "Why?" "I don't know yet," he said, with the same disconcerting honesty as before. "But I intend to find out." The coffee arrived. The platter of cheese bread arrived. And there, at that formica table under fluorescent light, with the fine rain hitting the window pane and Faria Lima roaring outside, Mariana Fonte began, for the first time in a long time, to feel warmth as something that could last more than an instant. The cheese bread was hot, and Mariana ate with the restraint of someone who was taught by hunger not to demonstrate hunger. Renato noticed but did not comment. There was a grammar of its own in that kind of pride, and he knew it well enough not to violate it. She spoke bit by bit, like someone opening a rusty faucet. First just drops, then a thread, and eventually something that began to have its own strength. There was no chronological order in what she told. There was emotion, and emotions obey different laws than those of time. Mariana had been, until 3 years ago, a customer service manager at an insurance brokerage in Bella Vista. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was enough. A rented apartment in Paraíso, a reasonable savings account, the feeling that life had stabilized after a difficult start. She had grown up in Guarulhos, the daughter of an absent father and a mother who worked in a textile factory until her body could no longer take it. Everything Mariana had she had built with the silent stubbornness of someone who has no safety net. And then came Gustavo. She didn't say his last name. She said only the name in the same way one says the name of a storm, with the involuntary respect of someone who survived it. Gustavo had arrived in her life as gales arrive, too fast to notice, too convincing to resist. A real estate businessman, articulate, with the kind of attention that makes a woman believe she has finally been seen. They were together for 2 years. "He didn't raise his hand," Mariana said, and there was in the phrase a kind of perverse care, as if she still needed to justify him. "He didn't need to. There were other ways." Renato listened without interrupting. He had learned over the years that silence was often the most valuable gift one could give to someone who was trying to find words for something that for a long time had no words. Gustavo had, with patience and method, isolated Mariana from her friends, convinced her to leave the brokerage to dedicate herself to the relationship. And when the relationship ended, she was without a job, without the network of friendships she had let dissolve, and without the apartment in Paraíso, which had been put in his name with the justification that it would be easier for the financing. "But there was my mother's," she said, "a tiny apartment in Ermelino Matarazzo. She passed it to me before she left." A pause. "It's been 4 years since she left." Renato understood the euphemism without needing to ask. "When I went to claim the apartment, he already had a paper signed by her." Giving it to him. Renato was quiet for a moment. "Did she sign it?" "I don't know what she signed." Mariana's voice didn't have anger at that moment. It had something worse, doubt. She was no longer well at the end. Her head came and went. "I think she didn't understand what she was signing. But in the courts—" She made a vague gesture with her hand. "In the courts, paper is paper." The legal process had lasted 18 months, consuming the last financial reserve she had managed to rebuild with temporary jobs. The lawyer she could afford didn't have the structure to face the firm Gustavo hired. The sentence had come out 6 months ago, and she had lost. Since then, Mariana had passed through a boarding house room in Meuxa, through the house of an acquaintance who wasn't exactly a friend, and in recent weeks, as the options narrowed, through the streets. "I don't always stay in the same place," she said, with a pragmatism that sounded more disturbing than any crying. "We learn where it is safer." Renato stayed with that phrase in his internal silence for a while. Then he said, "There's a hotel 3 blocks from here, the Maxime. I stay there when I have an early meeting the next day and don't want to drive back to Higienópolis." She looked at him. "I'm going to request a room for you, breakfast included, with no conditions, no explanation, nothing you don't want. If tomorrow morning you prefer to leave without talking to me, that's fine. Why would you do that?" The question was legitimate, and he treated it as such. He was quiet for a few seconds, looking at the coffee that was almost finished. "Because my mother was in a similar situation once, in Osasco. I had just gotten my first formal job and I sent money late, a week late. And in that week she spent 2 nights on the street." He paused. "I never forgave myself for that. So when I can, I stop, that's all." Mariana kept looking at him for a long time. There was something in the way he told that, without seeking absolution, without transforming his own pain into an emotional bargaining chip, that touched her in a way she didn't expect. "I am not charity," she said. It wasn't hostility. It was the most important statement she needed to make at that moment. "I know that," he replied. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a room and breakfast. Those are different things." She looked at the window pane. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk was still shiny. Faria Lima was an avenue that never completely slept, and there was something almost cruel in that continuous movement of cars and lights while some people were cold outside. "One night," she said finally. "One night," he agreed. When they arrived at the Maxime, the receptionist greeted Renato by name and showed no surprise at the situation. Renato asked for room 714, which he knew to be one of the largest on the floor, and left his credit card without ceremony. While the receptionist processed it, Renato turned to Mariana and said softly, "Her full name is Mariana Fonte. The room is in her name." It was a small detail, but for Mariana, who had spent months feeling that her own name had lost consistency, hearing those 2 words said out loud naturally by a stranger who treated her as a person was the detail that broke inside something she had built as protection, and that in reality was just isolation. She did not cry. But when she entered the elevator and the doors closed, she closed her eyes for a few seconds and breathed deeply, like someone who is learning again how to do that. Room 714 of the Maxime Hotel had a king bed with 300 thread-count sheets, a bathtub that Mariana stared at for almost a minute before filling, and a window that looked out over Faria Lima down below, with its cars and its lights and its glistening indifference. She stood at the window for a while in the hotel bathrobe, after the longest bath she had taken in weeks, maybe months, if she were honest with herself. There was something disturbing about being clean, not because cleanliness was bad, but because it revealed things that the dirt had covered. When you are surviving, you don't have the luxury of feeling. You just do. And now, in that silent room, with the smell of soap on her skin and her feet warmed by the plush rug, Mariana felt everything at once, and the weight of it almost doubled her over. She sat on the edge of the bed and stayed like that for a while, with her hands in her lap, letting it pass. This was what the therapist she had seen years ago, before Gustavo, before everything, called processing. You don't fight it, you let it pass. Like a flood, you go to high ground and wait for the water to go down. The water went down eventually. She lay down, and she slept with a depth she hadn't experienced for long enough not to remember when the last time had been. The next morning, Mariana woke up with the light coming through the cracks in the curtain and was disoriented for a few seconds, looking at the ceiling for information about where she was. Then the memory returned, ordered and without dramaturgy. The dinner, the jacket, the snack bar, her name said out loud at the counter. She used the toothbrush from the courtesy kit, combed her hair with her fingers because there was no hairbrush, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a longer time than she planned. There was something different in her face. Not the appearance. The dark circles were there, the vestige of accumulated exhaustion, but there was in her eyes something she didn't immediately recognize and which she later identified as the absence of immediate fear. The background fear existed, but the acute fear, that of not knowing where you will be 2 hours from now, had receded for a moment. Breakfast was on the second floor, in a hall overlooking an internal garden. Renato Cavalcante was already there when she arrived, with the same composed posture as always, reading something on his cell phone. When he saw her, he put the device on the table with a naturalness that indicated he wasn't pretending not to be waiting for her. He was waiting, and there was no need to disguise it. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I should have," she said. And there was in the answer a gentle self-criticism that he noted but did not expand upon. She served her plate at the buffet with more appetite than the previous night, and sat at the table with the discreet ease of someone who is relearning how to occupy space. Renato waited for her to eat before saying anything of substance, which she appreciated without saying so. "You spoke of a legal process yesterday," he said when the plates were half empty and the second coffee had arrived. "The case of the apartment." "It has already been judged," she said. "I lost." "Judged in the first instance?" She looked at him. "Are you a lawyer?" "No, but I have several in my office." A pause. "A first instance sentence is not the end. Did you have an appeal?" "My lawyer said there wasn't enough basis." Renato was quiet for a few seconds, with that expression she was beginning to identify as his way of thinking out loud without using words yet. "Can I ask someone from my office to take a look at the process? No strings attached, just to have a second opinion." She placed the cup on the table carefully. "Why would you do that? Are you going to ask me that every time I do something?" "As long as I don't understand the answer, yes." He gave that slow smile again, the same one from the snack bar, involuntary, as if she said things that caught him off guard in a way that he found, deep down, refreshing. "Because it seems unfair," he said, "and I have resources that you don't have. Using a resource where it makes a difference is not philanthropy. It's just using what you have for something that is worthwhile." She kept looking at him for a moment. There was a part of her, the part that Gustavo had trained to distrust generosity, that still looked for the trap. But there was no trap in his face. There was the exhaustion of a man who works hard, and something deeper she couldn't name yet, but which she recognized as being real. It was at that moment that the door to the breakfast hall opened and a woman entered. Mariana noticed her before understanding why she noticed. It was the kind of presence that didn't ask permission to be felt. Tall clothes that cost enough to be discreet without being invisible, impeccable dark hair. She was perhaps 40 years old and had the walk of someone who is used to having the attention of any room even before reaching the center of it. She saw Renato and stopped for half a second, a fraction of time too small for most people, but which Mariana, with the sharpened reflexes of someone who spent months reading people to stay safe, caught with precision. And then the woman walked to their table. "Renato." The voice was low and calibrated, with the artificial cordiality of someone who is being kind by strategic choice and not by impulse. "What a surprise to find you here." "Livia." He said the name without warmth or hostility, just the name. Are you staying here? Early morning meeting on Faria Lima, she said, and then shifted her gaze, slowly, with intention, to Mariana. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds in which Livia Drummond looked at Mariana Fonte with the expression of someone who is making a complete evaluation and has already reached her conclusions, and in which Mariana felt, with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who recognizes this type of look, that she had just been catalogued and discarded in a single operation. "Your companion?" Livia asked with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "My guest," Renato said, and there was in the correction something deliberate of someone who chooses each word with purpose. Livia smiled again, but this time there was something underneath the smile that Mariana identified without difficulty: jealousy, wounded vanity, and the determination of someone who hasn't yet decided how she will react, but already knows she will react somehow. "How kind of you," said Livia, and said goodbye with a lightness that was itself a form of disregard, and went to sit at a table on the other side of the hall, from where it would be impossible not to see the two of them. Renato did not comment. Mariana didn't either, but both felt, with the certainty of someone who recognizes the beginning of a complication, that breakfast had just changed in nature. Livia Drummond was not a person who left things to chance. She was a wealth management consultant, a partner in a financial boutique in Jardins, and had built her reputation on the ability to identify risks before they became problems. She applied this skill indiscriminately, to clients' portfolios, to social relations, and especially to situations that threatened what she considered hers. Renato Cavalcante had been, for almost 2 years, something between a boyfriend and a strategic partner. The relationship had never been clearly defined. He avoided labels, she preferred ambiguity, because ambiguity was power, but there was between the two a regular frequency of dinners, events, weekends in Campos de Jordão, and the tacit assumption of exclusivity that neither had verbalized and neither had violated, until then. After Renato left the breakfast hall, he had told Mariana that he needed to check the office, that the room was hers for the day if she wanted, and that he would send the lawyer's contact by message. Livia waited exactly 4 minutes, and then went to the reception. "Good morning," she said to the receptionist, with that smile she had learned to calibrate to produce spontaneous cooperation. "I am a consultant for Mr. Cavalcante from Arcavo. I need to check a reservation he made yesterday, his guest's room. There is a possible problem with the billing." The receptionist, a young man of about 25 named Douglas, hesitated. "I can check internally, but guest data—" "Douglas," Livia said, and there was in the use of the name a manufactured intimacy that was a technique, not a feeling. "Mr. Cavalcante himself asked me. You can check if you need to." It wasn't true, but Douglas had no way to verify at that moment, and Livia knew it. He typed something into the computer. "Room 714 is registered in the name of Mariana Fonte. Checkout scheduled for tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Livia repeated, with the controlled intonation of someone who is recording relevant information. "Yes, Mr. Cavalcante extended it at check-in." Livia thanked him with the same smile and left. In the elevator back to her own room, she stood looking at her own reflection in the polished metal door and thinking. There was a woman in a clearly precarious situation, staying in a hotel room paid for by Renato. There was something in the way he had said "my guest," not an acquaintance, not someone I was helping, that had sounded like a declaration. Renato did not make declarations by accident. Later that same day, while Mariana slept the nap that her body had claimed as overdue interest, the room phone rang. She woke up disoriented, took a moment to remember where she was, and answered. "This is the hotel management," said the voice, feminine, polite, with an underlying coldness. "We need to inform you that there was an inconsistency in your room reservation. The card holder contacted us and informed us that the reservation was made by mistake. We will need you to regularize it directly or vacate the room by 6 p.m. Mariana was quiet for a moment. There was in the message an impeccable logic and an even more impeccable falsehood. She knew this type of maneuver, not in this specific form but with this structure. Create a manufactured urgency. Put the person in a defensive position. make the burden of proving otherwise fall on the one who had the least conditions to prove it. "Can you give me the name of the person who made this contact?" she said, with a calm that surprised her. A pause. "You can come to the reception so we can check together." "I'll be down in 10 minutes, she said, and hung up. She put on her clothes slowly, breathed, went down, went. At the reception, there was a shift manager different from the morning receptionist, an older man with glasses and a professional expression. Mariana explained what had been said in the phone call. The manager checked the system with that expression of someone who is reconstructing an embarrassing situation. "Ms. Fonte, the reservation is active and there is no cancellation request registered here. Mr. Cavalcante's card is valid." He frowned slightly. This phone call did not come from the management. Mariana kept looking at him for a second. Where did it come from then? He did not answer directly, but there was something in the way he avoided her gaze that said, "Enough." She went back to the room and sat in the chair near the window for a while, looking at the city down below. There was a part of her, the part that had learned to be exhausted even before starting, that wanted to pack the few things she had and leave. It was easier. It was the move she knew. But there was another part, smaller but more stubborn, that stood firm. She picked up her cell phone with the battery finally charged after the whole night plugged in and opened the message Renato had sent in the morning. The lawyer's contact was named Dr. Fernanda Asuncion. There was a note with it. "She already knows it might be you. You can call whenever you want." Mariana kept looking at the message for a while, and then, for the first time in a long time, she did something she had forgotten how to do. She asked for help without apologizing for needing it. She dialed the number. The lawyer answered on the second ring with a voice that was objective and warm at the same time. The type of professional who had learned that empathy and competence are not mutually exclusive things. "Mariana Fonte? I was waiting for your contact." A brief pause. "Renato gave me a summary, but I need to hear from you. Can you tell me everything?" And Mariana told her, this time with more detail than she had managed the previous night, with her voice firmer than she expected, and with the growing feeling, strange and almost scary in its novelty, that there was, on the other side of the line, someone who was listening not out of obligation but out of conviction. When she hung up 40 minutes later, she had noted 3 dates, 2 names, and a procedure. There was also something less tangible but more important. The feeling that the process she had believed was the end of a story was, in reality, just a poorly resolved chapter that could still be reopened. Outside, the São Paulo of late afternoon sparkled under the orange winter light. Mariana stood looking at it for a while and thought that there was something in the city that was at the same time brutal and generous, that knocked you down and gave you back in ways you never predicted. She didn't know yet what was to come, but for the first time in a long time she felt that she wanted to know. Renato only learned of the phone call maneuver when he called the hotel in the afternoon to leave a message, and the manager, with the diplomacy of someone who is trying to signal a problem without creating an incident, hinted that there was a delicate situation that deserved his attention. Renato asked to speak with Mariana directly. She told him with the same economy of words as always, without inflating the drama or minimizing the fact. He listened, and there was in the silence that followed a different quality from the previous silences, tenser, more internal. "Do you know who it was?" he asked. "I have a hypothesis," she said. "Me too." A pause. "You don't need to do anything about this," she said. "I called Fernanda. She is looking into the case. I'm fine." There was something in the phrase "I'm fine" that he identified as being different from the other times she had said something similar. This time it sounded like the truth, even if partial. "I'll stop by later," he said. "You don't need to." "I know," he said, and she recognized the echo of her own answer from the previous night, and almost smiled. Renato hung up and stood for a moment, looking out the window of his office on the 22nd floor of the building that carried his name discreetly engraved at the entrance. Down below, Faria Lima moved with its usual urgency, indifferent to the human dramas being articulated on its floors. Livia Drummond had been, for almost 2 years, an important presence in his life. Not in the way soap operas romanticize, but in the way important people usually are. Complicated, stimulating, and at times exhausting. She was intelligent in a way Renato respected, and there were moments, especially at the beginning, when he had wondered if that could be something more consistent. But Livia had a need for control that she herself probably didn't recognize as a need. She would call it precision or risk management. And there was, underneath the competence and charm, a tendency to treat people as variables in an equation, including him. What she had done to Mariana was not an error in judgment. It was a pattern. He picked up his cell phone and sent a message to Livia. Short, direct. "We need to talk. Tonight. You choose the place." The response came in less than 2 minutes. Emiliano, at 8. Renato arrived at the Emiliano 5 minutes before the time. Livia arrived exactly on time, which he knew to be intentional. She was never late because being late was a sign of disorganization, and she was never early because being early was a sign of anxiety. Surgical punctuality was in itself an affirmation. They ordered wine. For a few minutes they spoke of peripheral things, the dinner with the Portuguese from the previous night, a piece of real estate market news. Renato let this space exist because he had learned that direct confrontations with Livia had lower returns than letting the silence work. It was she who broke it. "Who is she?" The question came out with a manufactured lightness that fooled neither of them. "Someone who needed help," he said. "Renato." The voice had a trace of impatience that she normally hid better. "You hosted a stranger in the hotel, paid for the room, sent a lawyer. That is not helping someone. It depends on how you define help. You've known her for less than 24 hours. Yes. He stood looking at her with that calm she always found difficult to penetrate. And yet I know more about her character than about that of many people I've known for years. Livia was quiet for a moment. There was something in what he had said that landed between them like a stone, not violent, but heavy. "Are you telling me something?" she asked. "I'm telling you that what you did this morning was not acceptable." She blinked. It was the first time in the whole conversation that he had said something direct, and the effect was precisely because of that more impactful. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but there was in the phrase a tenth of a second of hesitation that was enough. "Livia." He said the name without anger, with exhaustion. "The manager told me, and I know you well enough." The silence that followed was of a different quality than all the other silences of that night. It was the silence of someone who was caught not in the act, but in something worse, in the revelation of who they actually are. Livia recomposed herself. It was what she did. It was perhaps the thing she did with more efficiency than any other. "I was worried about you." "I know you believe that," he said. "But worry does not justify what you did." She kept looking at her wine glass. For a moment, Renato saw in her something that rarely appeared, real vulnerability, not the performative vulnerability she sometimes used as a tool, but something more naked and more honest. "Are you ending us because of her?" she asked, and her voice had a small crack. "I think we ended before," he said with kindness. "I think we both know that." She did not answer. But she also did not disagree, which was, between them, a form of agreeing. They finished the wine in silence. Renato paid the bill. On the way out, Livia stood for an instant on the sidewalk, looking at the street with an expression he couldn't completely read. "She is not what you think she is," Livia said, with her back to him. "Maybe," he replied, "but I intend to find out for myself." She left without looking back, and Renato stood for a moment on the cold sidewalk, watching the cars pass, thinking that some conversations are at once an end and a beginning, and that you rarely know while you are in them which of the two things will weigh more. He picked up his cell phone and sent a message to Mariana. "Can you have dinner with me tomorrow?" The response took a few minutes. When it came, it had only 5 words. "Can it be at the hotel?" He smiled at the screen. "It can be at the hotel," he replied. Dr. Fernanda Asunción was 41 years old and had the reputation of being the type of lawyer who didn't take a case she didn't believe she could win. Not out of risk aversion, she had spent the first 10 years of her career in the public defender's office, which was a private school of humility and stubbornness, but because she had learned that energy is a finite resource and that some cases need to be ignited from the inside to win outside. Mariana Fonte's case she had accepted on the afternoon of the initial call, after hearing the summary and asking for the documents by photo on her own cell phone. There was something in the process that caught her attention immediately. The signature of Mariana's mother on the property transfer document was not authenticated by a notary public, but by a neighborhood registry office with a registration number that she checked and that had been revoked for irregularities 2 years before the date of the document. It was a small detail. It was exactly the type of detail that an overworked lawyer in a lower-value process would ignore. She did not ignore it. 3 days after the initial call, Fernanda called Mariana with the specific tone of someone who has news that is not yet certain enough to celebrate, but has already passed the point of speculation. "I found an irregularity at the registry office," she said, "and I found a witness." Mariana was silent for a moment. Witness to what? To when the document was signed. A neighbor of your mother who was present in the apartment that day. A pause. She was not heard in the original process because no one looked for her. Your previous lawyer did not do a search for witnesses in the building. And she says your mother didn't know what she was signing. She says Gustavo presented the paper as being a power of attorney for bank matters. She was there. She saw it. Mariana sat in the chair near the window of room 714. She had stayed in the hotel longer than the promised night, because Renato had renewed the reservation without fanfare, and she had, after some internal resistance, accepted and stood looking at the city with slightly damp eyes. "Is that enough?" she asked. "It's not a certainty, but it is a basis for an appeal, and with the registry office irregularity, the second-instance judge will have to revisit it." Fernanda paused. "I'm not going to promise you victory, but I'm going to promise you that now we have an argument." It was enough. More than enough. That night, Mariana went down to the hotel restaurant where Renato had reserved a small table near the window, far from the other tables, with the pragmatism of someone who plans spaces with the same care they plan conversations. She had bought a simple blouse at a haberdashery near the hotel, the first new piece of clothing in months, and had looked at herself in the mirror before going down with the feeling of relearning herself. Renato was in a suit without a tie, relaxed in a way she had noticed was his standard state when he wasn't in work mode. He stood up when she arrived, and there was in the gesture something that was not formality but consideration, the type of small thing that says more than speeches. "Fernanda called," she said, even before sitting down. "I know, she sent me a message." He waited. "How are you?" "Scared," she said, with honesty. "When things start to get better, I keep waiting for the moment they get worse again." "That has a name," he said. "I know the name," she replied. "It doesn't mean it disappears just by knowing." He nodded his head without the urgency to fix what she had said. And it was this non-fixing that made her relax a little more in the chair. They had dinner with the slowness of those who have no other commitment that night, and the conversation deepened by layers. First the process, then each one's past, then the more imponderable things people only tell when they are starting to really trust. Renato spoke about the construction company with the restrained pride of someone who did something big but doesn't want to seem like he cares about the size. He spoke about his mother, Donna Benedita, who still lived in Brass and who went to the construction company once a month to check if her son hadn't gone completely crazy. He spoke about the strange feeling of having arrived at a place that when young was just an abstraction and discovering that the place itself was not the point. "What is the point?" Mariana asked. He was quiet for a moment. "To be able to stop when I want," he said finally. "To be able to cross a street and not have to keep walking just because that's what everyone else does." She understood what he was saying, not as a metaphor but as a declaration. When dinner ended and they went up together in the elevator, she to 714, he to 1102 where his usual suite was, there was between them that type of silence that is not empty but full, the type that precedes something that neither has named yet, but that both already know exists. On the 7th floor, the doors opened. Mariana stepped out. She turned in the hallway. "Renato." He looked. "Thank you." "Not for the room." She paused, searching for the exact words. For having crossed the street. He stood looking at her for a second that lasted more than a second. I also needed to cross, he said, with his voice a little lower than normal. The doors closed. She walked down the hallway to the room, opened the door and stood for a moment in the dark before turning on the light. There was, at that instant, the sensation of being in two places at the same time, in the place of someone who was still looking for ground, and in the place of someone who was already very discreetly beginning to find it. She didn't know yet all that was to come. She didn't know about the maneuvers Livia still had in mind. She didn't know about the phone call that would arrive in 2 days, with news that would change the course of the process. And she didn't know about the revelation that was stored in the heart of that story, waiting for the right moment to emerge. What she knew was that for the first time in a long time she wanted to know what came next. Livia Drummond had a specific talent for transforming hurt into strategy. It wasn't something she had planned to develop. It was a skill that had grown organically from years of learning that raw emotion was inefficient, and that everything you felt could be converted into useful action as long as you knew how to channel it. The conversation with Renato at the Emiliano had left a small and precise wound, the kind that doesn't bleed but burns, and that she had spent 2 days trying to convince herself was just a wound of pride, not of feeling. It was more comfortable to believe that. What she did next was not an explosion. It was surgical. Livia had contacts in 3 of the main corporate gossip outlets in São Paulo, not the serious business journalism, but the type of newsletter that circulated in WhatsApp groups of partners and executives, full of rumors attributed to close sources that no one ever identified. She had fed this circuit before strategically, for her own benefit or for clients. This time, she sent a message to a specific contact with carefully selected information. That Renato Cavalcante had hosted an unknown woman of uncertain origin at the Maxime. That the gesture had generated internal questioning about the executive's judgment, and that there were speculations about the impact of this on an ongoing merger. It wasn't a complete lie which was what made it dangerous. It was the assembly of true facts in a misleading sequence, the most sophisticated technique of disinformation, because it is the hardest to dismantle. The note circulated, and it reached through paths Livia had not completely calculated, Augusto Mellado. Augusto Mellado was 62 years old, founder of an investment fund based in Campinas, and was in advanced negotiations with Archavo for a merger that had taken 18 months to reach the point where it was. He was a man who had built everything he had with a simple criterion. He only did business with those he respected as human beings, not just as professionals. He called Renato the next morning. Renato was in the office when Mellado's number appeared on the screen. He answered with the composure of someone who doesn't know yet what he is about to hear, but guesses it isn't trivial. "Renato," said Mellado, without preamble, "I received a little note about you this week. The anonymous type, the type that circulates in insecure graduate groups." A pause. "I don't care about that kind of thing, but I want to hear from you what is happening." Renato was silent for a moment, and then, with the honesty that was his most constant trait, he told him. Not an edited or strategic version, he told everything: the cold night, Mariana on the street, the jacket, the snack bar, the hotel, the legal situation, the conversation with Livia. He told it without making himself a hero and without making Livia a villain, just the facts, in the sequence in which they had happened. Mellado listened in silence. When Renato finished, there was a pause. "You know you didn't need to tell me all that," said Mellado. "I know. But you told me anyway." "Yes." Another pause. "My father was a shoemaker in Franca," said Mellado suddenly. "And once, when I was about 12, there was a flood and the house of the family that lived on the other side of the street flooded. Everyone in the neighborhood just stood watching. My father crossed with a boot in his hand." A shorter pause. "I never forgot that." Renato was quiet. "The merger continues," said Mellado. "And I want to meet this young lady. Anyone who makes Renato Cavalcante cross Faria Lima at midnight must have something interesting." When Renato hung up, he stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at the window. There was something that life taught repeatedly, and that he kept forgetting, that people of character recognize character, and that the only strategy that worked consistently was not to have a strategy. It was just to be who you were and trust that the right people would see. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Livia's actions were finding their point of return. The receptionist Douglas had been left with that weighing on him for days. He was young and had learned, in the worst possible way in previous jobs, that silent connivance was a form of complicity. He sought out the general manager and reported the entire episode, that he had provided guest information to a third person without authorization, and that that same person had, apparently, made a phone call pretending to be the management. The hotel identified the source number of the fake phone call. It was a number registered in the name of a consultancy firm, a firm that appeared in the service contract as a provider for Livia Drummond Consultores Associados. The management of the Maxim was a commercial partner of Arcavo in several ventures. The hotel's lawyer contacted Renato's legal office on the same day, and so it was that Livia Drummond, who had spent her entire life managing risks with almost scientific precision, was caught by the only risk she had underestimated, that the people she had treated as variables each had their own moral axis. When Renato's lawyer called her formally, communicating that the hotel was considering appropriate measures for improper use of guest data and for falsehood in communication with the staff, Livia was silent for a few seconds that were, for those who knew her, an eternity. She always had an answer, always had the next move. This time she didn't. "I will contact my lawyer," she said, and hung up. She stood in her office in Jardins for a long moment, looking at the glass and steel desk she had chosen with such care, at the paintings on the walls that transmitted exactly the message she had planned to transmit, at the city outside that remained indifferent to the fact that she had, in a single, poorly calculated movement, begun to undo years of reputation, built with much more care than anything she had done that week. There was a fine irony in all this that she would probably only be able to see much later, that the greatest risk of her career had been not a competitor, not a volatile market, not a difficult client. It had been herself, in a moment when she had let hurt sit in the place of intelligence. That same night, while Livia stayed alone with the consequences of her own acts, Mariana Fonte sat at the window of room 714 with her cell phone in her lap and a newly sent message to Fernanda. "You can file it." It was a 4-word phrase, but it had the weight of everything she had carried in the last 3 years. It was the phrase of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for existing and for having been wronged. It was the phrase of someone who still didn't know everything that was about to come to light, about the process, about Renato, about herself, but who had made the most important decision before knowing any of those things, the decision not to give up. The city below continued with its routine of lights and engines and parallel lives happening simultaneously, each with its invisible weight, and Mariana looked at all of that for a long moment before closing the curtain and breathing deeply, like someone who is practicing again a skill she almost forgot she had. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in August, in a courthouse in Bella Vista, 3 weeks after the filing of the appeal. Fernanda had prepared Mariana with the meticulousness of someone who knows that what happens before the courtroom matters as much as what happens inside it. You are going to sit, you are going to listen, and when it is your turn to speak, you speak only what we agreed on, the lawyer had said at the meeting 2 days before. Don't let emotion become an argument. The emotion is real, but the argument needs to be stronger than it. Mariana had listened and agreed, and had spent the previous night between sleep and wakefulness, with fragments of her mother's life emerging in her memory with that specific sharpness of memories that are kept for years and only appear when you are alone in the early morning. Donna Benedita sitting on the porch of the apartment in Ermelino Matarazzo, with the smell of coffee and the radio in the background. Donna Benedita running her hand through her hair when she was younger, with that affectionate firmness that was their language of love, because words didn't always come easily. Donna Benedita in the last years, with her head coming and going, confusing dates and names, but always recognizing her daughter's voice, always. That apartment was the only concrete asset Donna Benedita had accumulated in life. It was a small thing from the point of view of someone looking from the outside. It was everything from the point of view of someone who understands what it represents. Renato had offered to take her to the courthouse. She had declined, not out of pride, but because there was something about that day that needed to be hers. She arrived with Fernanda 40 minutes before the time and sat in the courthouse hallway with her knees together and her hands in her lap, looking at the movement of processes and people and employees with folders, thinking that there was something almost absurd in the fact that entire lives were decided in hallways like that, under fluorescent light and the smell of old paper. On the other side of the hallway, Gustavo arrived with 2 lawyers and a suit that cost enough to be noticed. He saw her. She saw him. There was between the two a second of eye contact that she had mentally rehearsed dozens of times, and that, when it actually happened, was much simpler than she had expected. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. She felt, with a clarity that surprised her, almost nothing, and perceived that almost nothing was, in that context, exactly what she needed to feel. He diverted his gaze first. The hearing lasted 2.5 hours. Fernanda presented the report from the revoked registry office with the precision of someone who had waited for this moment. She presented the testimony of Donna Cecilia, who had gone personally to the courthouse at 81 years old and with a memory firmer than most people in the room, and who described, with the objectivity of someone who was simply reporting what she had seen, the day a man she did not know had arrived at the apartment with papers and left with a signature that she had not understood at the time, but that later, with time, she had been ruminating on. The second instance judge was a man of about 55, with the tired expression of someone who has seen a lot, but there was in his gaze an attention that Mariana noticed, and that Fernanda had previously described as the type of judge who still actually reads the case files. He asked questions, listened to the answers, asked more questions, and then came the moment that changed everything. One of Gustavo's lawyers, trying to disqualify Donna Cecilia's testimony, asked a question about Donna Benedita's cognitive capacity at the time of the signature, and in doing so, presented a medical report that, according to him, demonstrated she was in full capacity. Fernanda was quiet for a second, and then she asked to examine the document. The report was dated almost a year before the signature in question, and there was in it, in the observations field, a note that the doctor had made and that no one until that moment had paid attention to, a reference to episodes of temporal confusion and difficulty in understanding complex documents, with the recommendation that the patient be accompanied by a family member in situations involving legal or financial decisions. It was Gustavo's own report that buried Gustavo's argument. Fernanda read the excerpt out loud slowly, so that each word stayed in the air of the room with the weight it deserved. There was a silence. Gustavo's lawyer tried to contextualize. The judge raised his hand with the gesture of someone who doesn't need to hear more. Mariana kept her eyes fixed on an indefinite point in front of her, because if she looked at Fernanda she was going to cry, and she had promised herself she wouldn't cry. She managed for exactly 2 minutes after the judge closed the session with the information that the process would be reopened for complementary instruction, and that there was, in light of the new evidence, a solid foundation for the revision of the previous sentence. She left the courthouse with Fernanda and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the August sun hitting her face, and then she cried. Not the crying of someone who lost, but the crying of someone who carried too much weight for too long, and finally found a place to set it down. Fernanda stayed beside her without saying anything, which was exactly right. When Mariana picked up her cell phone to send a message to Renato, there was one already waiting. How was it? She looked at the question and typed, with her fingers still slightly trembling, "I think we won." The response came immediately. "I knew it." She looked at those 3 words for a long time. There was something in them, in the confidence without ostentation, in the certainty said in a low voice. That was different from anything anyone had said to her in recent years. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a performance, it was simply someone who had believed before having a reason to believe, and who had been right. And Mariana Fonte, standing on the sidewalk of a courthouse in Bella Vista, on a São Paulo August day, with red eyes and a heart a little lighter than it had been in a long time, began to understand that that story was not about the apartment. It had never been about the apartment. It was about her, about the woman she had been before Gustavo, and who was, slowly and with much work, finding the way back to herself. And that this time, different from the last, she wasn't making that journey alone. She stood one more moment on the sidewalk, letting the sun hit her. Then she put away her cell phone, straightened her coat, and began to walk, not with haste, not with an immediate destination, but with the step of someone who is recognizing the ground beneath her own feet. Bella Vista was in its August rhythm, with bars opening for lunch and fruit vendors at the intersections and the background noise that is the sound signature of São Paulo at any time of day. Mariana walked through all of that and thought that there was something fair in the fact that that moment had happened there, in that neighborhood where she had worked years ago, where she had had lunch at plastic tables on the sidewalk and drunk coffee from a disposable cup before the Monday meeting. The city had been the stage for many things in her life. It could be the stage for this too. 3 months later, Mariana Fonte passed through the revolving door of a building on Avenida Paulista with a folder of documents under her arm and the expression of someone who has a scheduled appointment and arrived 5 minutes before the time. The building housed, among others, the office of the Cavalcante Foundation, an initiative that Renato had founded 2 years ago and that offered legal, financial, and relocation support for women in situations of vulnerability. There was something he hadn't told Mariana until weeks after the first meeting, and which, when she learned, produced in her that kind of silent fit of someone who understands the logic of several things at once, all at once. The foundation had been created in memory of his mother, Donna Benedita, who had gone through a similar situation in Osasco decades ago, and who had, over the years, told her son more than once that the money he earned would only be worth it if it were used so that other people wouldn't have to go through what she had gone through. Mariana had started working at the foundation 6 weeks after the hearing, when the revision sentence had arrived, and with it the confirmation that the apartment in Ermelino Matarazzo would return to her name. She hadn't entered through the door that someone who needs help enters, although that was exactly what she had been. She had entered through the door that someone who has something to offer enters, and what she had to offer was precisely the experience of having gone through all that, and having reached the other side. She coordinated the initial service for the women who arrived at the foundation. She listened. She asked questions. She didn't promise what she couldn't guarantee, but she guaranteed what she could. Presence, referral, and the information said with simplicity and without condescension that that situation was not definitive. There was in this a circularity that was not poetic by intention, but by nature. It was simply what happens when someone who received help in a time of need finds the way to transform that help into something that continues. Renato had learned in these months that there was a difference between admiring someone from afar and knowing someone up close, and that Mariana Fonte was more than he had perceived on that cold night on Faria Lima. She was precise, shy in a selective way, with a dry humor that appeared in the moments when she was relaxed enough to let it. She had firm opinions about things most people didn't consider important enough to have firm opinions about, and she stayed silent about things most people thought needed to be discussed out loud. They had had dinner with Melado on a Tuesday in September at a restaurant in Pinheiros that none of the three had chosen because it was famous. They had chosen it because the food was good and the tables were spaced enough to talk without being overheard. Melado had arrived with the simplicity of someone who has enough not to need to demonstrate anything anymore, and had listened to Mariana for almost an hour before saying anything about business. When the bill arrived, he had looked at Renato with that expression that replaced words, the expression of someone who is confirming, without ceremony, something he had already decided. The merger had been signed 4 weeks later. Livia Drummond had reached an out-of-court settlement with the Maxime Hotel, with the discretion of someone who prefers to resolve things away from the spotlight. She had temporarily distanced 2 important clients during the period of noise and had, this Renato learned through a mutual contact, gone through some difficult weeks before starting to rebuild. He had not wished the worst for her. He had wished, with the honesty of someone who knew someone for real before understanding that it wasn't enough, that she would find a way to be less alone than she had been. Because underneath all the strategy and all the competence, there was a considerable loneliness, and he had seen that sometimes in the moments when she let it slip. On an October afternoon, when the São Paulo winter had finally receded and the sun returned with that specific quality of the end of the year in São Paulo, more horizontal, more golden, less urgent, Renata went to pick up Mariana at the foundation. She came out with the folder under her arm and her hair tied back, and an expression that was at once tired and satisfied, the way people are when they have worked all day on something that matters. They walked along Paulista without a specific destination, with that freedom of the end of the workday in a city that, when you stop fearing it, has a very particular beauty. "Are you doing well?" he asked at one point. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am," she said, and there was in the answer this time a solidity that wasn't there on the cold July night, a solidity that hadn't been given by anyone, but built by her, brick by brick, choice by choice in the months that had passed. He said nothing more, and she didn't need to say anything more. They walked side by side along the most famous avenue in the country, two human beings with complicated stories and futures still being written, while São Paulo did what São Paulo always does. It moved forward, noisy and indifferent and full of life, oblivious to the fact that sometimes, on a cold July night, someone crosses a street and changes two lives at the same time. Because love, the real kind, the kind that stays, does not begin with grandiose promises or cinematic gestures. It begins with someone who stops when everyone else keeps walking, and who later, slowly, learns that stopping was the most courageous thing they ever did. End of story. If this story touched something in you, dear listener, it is because it was made with what is most true in human relationships, the courage to be seen and the generosity to see. Here on the channel, every week, we bring stories like this, of ordinary people who face extraordinary situations and find along the way something they weren't looking for but needed. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Each subscription is a sign that you want to continue being part of these stories. Leave a like too. It helps other people discover this space. And in the comments, tell us, what moment from this story stayed with you? We read everything. Until the next story.